Okay, hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion, where we'll be deep diving into why the UK needs a broad text and data mining exception to support AI innovation. My name is Aisha Bhatti, and I'm Head of Digital Policy for the UK and EU at ITIF's Centre for Data Innovation, the leading pro-innovation think tank studying the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. So, why are we here today? AI is no longer just a tool to boost productivity, it's fast becoming a driver for national competitiveness. The UK government's AI Opportunities Action Plan makes clear its ambition to become a global leader in this space. But to train powerful, competitive models, you need access to data, most of which lives on the open web. Now, this process of using internet data raises several questions, one of which is the role copyright law plays in enabling or blocking access to that data. As many of you know, the UK government recently closed its consultation on possible changes to the UK's copyright framework. The proposals on the table could have major implications for both AI developers and the creative sector. The UK now has a chance to update its legal framework in a way that supports innovation while also respecting creative work. And in this panel, we'll dig into why a broad text and data mining exception is essential. Now, before we begin, for those in attendance, we encourage you to submit questions for the speakers. There should be a Slido link in the description of whatever platform you're using to view this panel, whether that's YouTube or on the event webpage. So please do submit your questions and we'll try and integrate those into the conversation as we progress through the panel. So without further ado, I think we'll get started. And I've got some fantastic experts lined up for you today. So first, we have Julia Willemines. Julia is the co-founder and co-director of the Centre for British Progress, a think tank that grew out of the work of UK Day One, a non-partisan initiative dedicated to supercharging UK growth and progress by transforming ideas from the science, technology and innovation community into implementation-ready policies. Next, we have Benjamin White. Ben is a researcher at the Centre of Intellectual Property Policy and Management at Bournemouth, researching AI, IP, and trade law. Ben is also co-founder of Knowledge Rights 21, an Arcadia-funded project that advocates for regulatory change to support research, education, and efficient knowledge transfer. Finally, we have Burton Martins. Burton is an economist and senior research fellow at Bruegel, a Brussels-based economic policy think tank. He's also a non-resident research fellow at the Tilburg Law and Economic Centre at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Thank you all so much for being here today. So to kick us off, I thought it'd be useful to take a step back for a moment and actually start by looking at why copyright exists, what it serves, who it serves. Because often in the AI and copyright debate, I think we start from an assumption about why copyright exists. And because of that, it can sometimes lead not only to incorrect assumptions, but also incorrect policy outcomes. So I'd love to hear from each of you, from your perspective, what do you consider to be the purpose of copyright protection? Maybe we can start with Julia, and then we'll go to Burton, and then finally Ben.
Yeah, so I see copyright as a legal right for creators of original works to control the reproduction, distribution, or licensing of the work. That's sort of what it does, the definition of the thing itself. But then I also see that there's this kind of functionally, what does it do in society and in the economy? And a lot of it, from my perspective, comes down to certainty. So it gives certainty to businesses using content, to researchers, to right holders, to courts. It's effectively a set of rules that governs how content is created, and that allows for the legal use of content.
Great, thanks, Julia. Burton, what is the purpose of copyright?
I'm an economist and I look at copyright from an economic perspective. So copyright is a tool, an economic policy instrument to stimulate investment in creative works, basically media works. And the amount of protection that copyright should provide depends on what is the optimal level of protection to stimulate investment, but also to stimulate further use once something has been created, further use of that product in society. So there is a balance in copyright between the incentive part and the wider distribution and use in society.
Great, thanks, Burton. And Ben, what do you consider to be the purpose of copyright?
I guess I'll give more sort of an academic and then a real politic answer to that question. So lots of ex post academic justifications for copyright, which I won't go through because I don't think they're particularly useful. What does copyright protect? Copyright is designed to protect what is called substantial similarity. So substantial similarity in expression. Copy does not mean to copy in English. It refers to the sense of copy as we use in journalism. Copyright does not protect ideas, facts, themes, links, and sort of pure data. And the answer, I guess, to that question depends on the jurisdiction. So if we look in the UK and European legislation, I don't see any particular description of what copyright is for, other than the things that I've just outlined. If you look in the United States Constitution, you of course have it's for the promote the progress of science and useful arts, not fine arts, useful arts. If you look at the UK, our first UK copyright law was an act for the encouragement of learning. I like Article 34 of the Japanese Copyright Act, which has defined the purpose of copyright to be the protection of expression, and therefore it does not cover non-expressive uses which human beings cannot perceive. So it very much allows mere reproduction, automated production by machines, and potentially other uses. And I suppose I would just pick up the two previous speakers. It protects all forms of expression. It isn't just about the entertainment industries. I come from a science perspective and research, so it covers all sectors of the economy, because all sectors of the economy use computers to copy information and data.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think you highlight a really interesting point that often gets lost in this debate, which is the dichotomy between the idea itself and the expression of that idea. And I also wasn't really aware of how different jurisdictions have a kind of different idea of the purpose for what the law is trying to achieve. So Julia, moving to you, you've recently published a report, Copyright and AI, the Case for a Pro-Growth Approach, where you make your case for a more permissive regime by extending the current data mining exception for non-commercial use in the UK to commercial use. Now, before I ask you about that, I was wondering if you could first briefly explain what is text and data mining and why is it so crucial for AI development?
Yeah, so text and data mining is, to grossly simplify it, effectively when often on the internet, data is scraped, and that data, that information is then used to train an AI model. So what's important to note is that it's not like a database. It's not like the AI model has this like set of data that it's then retrieving and spitting out when you then prompt it. But much like a person learns through like content consumption in some ways, data is used as like, I guess, like the fuel of AI systems. So they're trained on this data that is often scraped through text and data mining. Some of that data also comes from sort of like other data sets, but it's definitely, if you think about any of the widely used AI models today, all of them will have scraped data through text and data mining to train their models. In terms of the research that I did, making a case for a text and data mining exception, I think there were like three things that were relatively like additions to the debate. So one of the things that the paper tries to do is a comparative analysis of legal systems across the world. So specifically comparing the UK system, where text and data mining is limited only for non-commercial purposes, to places where they have more liberal systems, like the US, where you have the fair use regime, but also like countries like Japan, where you have explicit TDM exceptions, so where you are allowed to do text and data mining for the purposes of training. And also to places like China that have interesting copyright regimes, in the sense that like what is said by the law and what is actually practiced is slightly different. The second thing the paper attempts to do is model some of the economic consequences of having a more closed regime versus a more open regime. And here what we looked at was different scenarios, looking both at what the impacts of not having training occurring in the UK would look like, but also the impacts of what the economic situation would look like if you impact deployment. So that's a distinction that I think lots of people, that it would be very easy to miss. There's a difference between what you can legally do from a training perspective and then what you can legally do from a deployment perspective. So in the UK, training most AI models is very difficult because there isn't this exception, or it's like you're very clearly not allowed to train on publicly available data through text and data mining. But you can deploy products that have been trained in this way. So that's why you see ChatGPT deployed on the British market, even though it has been trained in a way that's not compliant with our copyright laws. So we looked at the economic modeling, both of like the positives of having training happen in the UK, and then the potential negatives of restricting deployment in the UK. And the like headline figure is that in 5 years you can get impacts on the scale of like 30 billion using very conservative modeling. So we're not assuming AGI here. We're assuming that actually the economic impacts are like on the lower bound of what many economists consider the growth potential of AI. And thirdly, what the paper does is look at what a TDM exception could look like in a UK context. So we base this off of the Japanese model. And what's interesting about the Japanese model is they put in the TDM exception a long time ago, but they've published renewed guidance on what this exception means in the age of AI that makes a distinction between what is allowed on a deployment, on a training perspective. So, and then how copyright laws come in on a generation or utilization stage. So again, simplifying quite a bit. It's you're allowed to train using publicly available copyrighted works. So the system is allowed to learn based off of these works. But if at the generation and utilization stage, those copyrighted works are being reproduced, whether it is by accident or because you're fine-tuning the model or overfitting the model or using retrieval augmented generation, then that would be an instance of copyright infringement. And I think that is a very reasonable way to protect rights holders while not having the negative effects of restricting a technology like AI.
Great, thanks, Julia. I do think it is important to highlight when we look at the life cycle of AI development that there is a distinction between training purely to have this model in place versus using a model to then generate works that could infringe on pre-existing rights holders' works. I'm also conscious that we did reference the consultation. However, I was wondering if you could also just summarize some of the options that the UK government is considering at the moment. I think that would be useful. Yeah. Thanks, Julia.
Yeah. So I guess there are 4 options that have been outlined in the consultation. Option 0. I mean that they don't. Yeah, it's not 1 to 4, it's 0 to 3. Option 0 is not doing anything, so staying with the current legal framework, which is obviously really difficult because it's unclear for businesses and where liability sits, and also for content for rights holders in terms of like how their data is being used by models that are being trained elsewhere. So going back kind of to that certainty point that I talked about at the start, then one of the options is to have a TDM exception. So that's kind of like our preferred option for the reasons I started to outline. Then there's an option to have an opt-out model. So would be something similar to the EU legislation, where rights holders can opt out to have their content trained on AI systems. And then finally, there's a option to have a fully a full licensing regime system, so where no training can happen unless you explicitly have a licensing agreement with those with rights holders.
Great, thank you. I also love that you mentioned jurisdictions that we will hopefully get into later on in the panel, namely the EU and Japan as well. So moving to you now, Ben, I think one of the biggest misconceptions around this debate in AI and copyright is that it just involves the media industry. But as you kind of alluded to earlier, and an aspect of the creator community that you represent as well as researchers, which is often forgotten in that debate. Do you think you could talk a little bit more about the breadth of stakeholders that are involved in this conversation? And then could you also elaborate on how the current regime is impacting the research community?
Yeah. Just so we're very concerned at the framing of the consultation. Generative AI models, which produce creative works like those that come from the entertainment industry, are a subset of numerous different outputs that generative AI models can produce, science, etc., etc. Generative AI models are a subset of neural networks. Neural networks are a subset of machine learning models. Significant machine learning models do not produce any sort of form of output, and many of them don't train on any data either. So it feels to me that the consultation is focused on the 1%, and yet, as you said, as we know, machine learning is used across every single sector of the economy. And as I said in my introduction, the rules that affect singers affect scientists, and the rules that affect clinicians affect composers as well. So copyright is a sort of a horizontal one-size-fits-all. If we're interested in the entertainment industry, my organization argues that we should have, targeted cultural policies which seek to deal with the problem rather than dealing with bodies of law one size fits all that will affect science if we go down and adopt option 3 with all the kind of concerns that come from that for science. Sorry, Asha, what was so one was the breadth and the other question
it was on how the current copyright regime in the UK is impacting the research community.
Yeah, so let's not forget that in 2014, because of the EU copyright regime, the UK was limited in only being able to introduce a non-commercial exception for text and data mining. And what it did at that point in time was it recognized 4 things. One, it recognized that data analysis is about using data and information which is not protected by copyright law, as I said in the beginning. So it recognized that that's the purpose of a lot of machine learning, and the only reason copyright is relevant is because this information is often wrapped in a copyright or a database wrapper. So it recognized that it wouldn't be proportionate to require licensing to use information and data which is in the public domain. Secondly, it represented that it understood that that licensing was disproportionate because the target of this was not, of majority of this was not subject to copyright at all. And I can say, as former head of licensing at the British Library, licensing at scale in order to access information in the public domain is entirely disproportionate to, is not possible. You know, you cannot scalably license information in a way that gets all the licenses interoperable for information in the public domain. Not good for our economy, which other jurisdictions outside of Europe have recognized. Thirdly, it recognized that we invest something like 20 billion a year in science. So we have triple, quadruple dipping here. The taxpayer pays for science. We then buy it back through journals. We then buy it back in order to put it on our VLEs and our intranets in private industry. And then a fourth time we have to buy back publicly funded science. 80% of research is publicly funded in order for it to mine and use facts and data which are in the public domain. It rejected licensing, and for our research intensive industries, those reasons stand as good today as they did 10 years ago. If the issue is cultural policy, we focus on cultural policy. But what we should have is a flexible regime. If we want to compete with the best, the US, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, we have to have the best laws, and that is not option 3.
Great, thanks, Ben. Now, Bertin, you've done a huge amount of work on the EU side and IP laws in that domain. And I was just wondering if you could explain what the EU's current copyright regime is and some of the arguments that were put forward to justify that regime.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. And I will build a little bit on what Julia and Ben just said, because they explained the TDM exception and the opt-outs of that exception. And indeed, in the EU at the moment, under the copyright regime, we have a text and data mining exception, which is unrestricted for non-commercial research purposes, but has an opt-out option when it's commercial text and data mining. And so this is starting to play a role in AI models, because, as was said before, AI models are sort of general purpose technology now that is spreading out across the entire economy, far beyond the media sector and far beyond academic research. And so basically covers 100% of GDP. But at the same time, with the opt-out option, rights holders can block the access to the content that is needed for AI model training. And so a very small part, the media component basically of GDP, holds hostage the rest of the economy and determines whether or not the rest of the economy can get access to those very valuable training data. This is becoming a problem because a lot of spillover effects are being stopped through that opt-out option from TDM. We know from empirical research that the number of opt-outs on web pages, which is the basic data set for AI model training, the number of opt-outs is currently around 25 to 30% and counting, and increasing further. So that there is already not enough training data for the largest AI models. And these opt-out options further reduce that volume of training data available. And so that affects the quality of models. And recent research has shown that indeed the quality of models goes down as a result of these opt-outs. It makes it also very difficult for for users in specific domains who need access to specific type of web content that is often blocked by TDM exceptions to actually get there. So it has a negative impact on the rest of the economy. Now, the code of practice for the implementation of these copyright laws in the EU, a draft of that has been released recently, and it tries to find a middle way to solve this. And the option seems to be to go for collective licensing. Now, collective licensing is something that has been discussed many times, but in my view, doesn't work very well because it means some copyright organization in a country has to set a collective licensing price. Some AI developers may be able to afford that, others not. But even those who pay that price, they will get access to all the data in that country. But how do you allocate the revenue from that collective license to millions of rights holders, millions of web page designers who are unknown, unidentifiable, and would not even be aware of this system in the EU? And if they would get part of the revenue, would get a fraction of a cent, which means huge transaction costs for the intermediary organization. We also noticed that AI developers start signing license agreements with some publishers because they want access to that web content, but they do so only with a selected few large publishers. As a result of that, the data sets available for AI model become limited to a few big publishers, and the sets become biased, and the models become biased because they don't have access to the long tail of small publishers who are not covered by these licenses. And clearly, even big AI companies are not going to sign licenses along that long tail of small publishers. It's far too costly in terms of transaction costs. It's not feasible. And so we get biased models with partial information, and that's not a good thing again. That's bad for the quality of those models. So overall, my argument would be to say that we have to drop these opt-out options for AI model training in line with, for example, the Japanese regime, which says that when it's not for human enjoyment, it's only for use for model training, then this should be allowed. Also, the EU Code of Practice for the implementation of this says that models should not be allowed, AI models should not be allowed to reproduce the training content that they've used for training the models. And I think that is a fair rule because, as was said before, copyright is meant that you should not be able to just copy free of charge any media content. And that is the main purpose of copyright. But you can very well keep that rule while still allowing the use for model training. Recopying, reproduction of training content was a problem for the earliest generation of generative AI models. But today, I think this problem has largely been solved. We'll come back to that, by the way, in the next part of our discussion.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Martin. Yeah. Ben, go ahead.
I realized I didn't really sort of set out the problems with the current UK regime. So we've got an exception for non-commercial use. There's a very good ebook, which is based upon the experience of the Alan Turing Institute in a project wanting to digitize and analyze newspapers. So the existing exception doesn't allow universities to share training data or analysis data with other universities within proportionate partnerships, doesn't allow NHS trusts to share training data derived from in copyright materials like journal articles or materials scraped off the web, let alone public-private partnerships like Cambridge University. Lots of universities have public-private partnerships. So again, proportionate sharing between industry and universities in the NHS. DeepMind works in the NHS of materials scraped from the web or derived from books or scientific journals is unlawful. You know, let's think about COVID. We know that scientists scraped and analyzed Twitter and social media to monitor the spread of the infectious disease and also then misinformation. The social media platforms have all opted out in Europe, as far as I'm aware. That isn't possible in Japan. There's a very recent case in the United States which says that X cannot prevent scraping of data because it is fair use. So, using copyright to sort of protect commercial creators from the entertainment industries might make sense, but it doesn't make sense if you think about the downsides that I've just outlined, Burton's just outlined, and Julia has outlined, which is why I think, things like a sort of a digital platform tax or something that we see in Canada, there are other ways that we can use to channel money to these communities. Copyright is not the tool. And also, I think if we look at countries like the US, Japan, Korea, they have very, very, very successful exports of cultural goods while they have a flexible copyright regime. And it is very clear that that flexible copyright regime supports creators who have to use information as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
It's not a zero-sum game, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go on to the Japan's copyright regime very shortly. But I totally agree that I think I'm yet to be convinced of there needing to be a distinction between non-commercial and commercial use, because, as COVID demonstrated, and as a lot of other examples also demonstrate, there's a lot of good work that goes towards public good that comes from commercial entities as well. So I just think it seems a shame to cut off that whole section for what seems to be a very arbitrary distinction. And Burton, going back to
80% of science is publicly funded.
Yeah.
I think just in science, if we're thinking about that, we have to keep going back. It's paid for already by the taxpayer.
Yeah. Now, Burton, just going back to your point as well on some of the implications of having an opt-out TDM exception. I know in your report you actually highlighted a collective opt-out regime that happened in France with a copyright management organization, and you made the argument that as a result that really only harms French music because there's a lack of representation within the models that then develop in that country. So could you elaborate a bit on that for us as well?
Yeah, if you do collective rights management by country, first of all, you get a very colorful map of Europe with different countries having different regimes, and for an AI model developer, that's very hard to manage. So where do you collect data? Where can you collect? Do you know in which country you're collecting a specific data set? And yes, if you do it in one country, France or whatever country alone, you put up a high price for access to the data from that country, while the price for access to data from other country is not affected. So naturally, AI model developers are going to circumvent that and going to collect data from other countries. And for instance, French music will be less well represented in the pre-training of AI models. And as a consequence, the quality for French music producers to produce more French music will go down. So basically, I think media industries want to have their cake and eat it at the same time. They're all using these models to increase their own productivity already at this moment, and they benefit from good quality models. And by withholding their data for training, they reduce the quality of this model, so it cuts into their own flesh.
Great, thank you. And Julia, do you think the same thing will happen in the UK as well if we do go for an opt-out regime?
Yeah, I think that's likely to happen. Although one thing I would say is, depending on what the opt-out regime looks like, it might be that the restrictions fail to do the one thing that they say that they're going to do, which is make sure that rights holders retain the ability to control when their data is being used by AI models. Copyright laws are set at a national level. They're not set internationally, which means that, and a lot of the data that's being used by these AI models can be accessed from other places around the world. So it means that British, French data is likely being used by ChatGPT, but it's not happening. It's not happening within those jurisdictions. So the positive spillover effects of having companies that are able to build this technology in those jurisdictions is limited. Now, what you could do is then restrict the deployment of that technology locally, and the economic effects of that are actually even worse. You would think that maybe that would protect rights holders, at least in that market, from having an incentivized licensing. But I'm not so sure it would. And it would also come with costs, and the costs being consumers in those markets not having access to the best models, which slows down technology diffusion, has negative productivity effects, and has wide macroeconomic effects probably. And then there's the question of okay, let's say these companies do want to license, which for the reasons I outlined, and I don't know if that would happen. Let's say they do want a license. The problem is that every piece of data isn't worth very much to the models. These models operate at scale. So if you are an individual content creator, we're actually doing some work on this to make actual predictions of how much money you would make per piece of content, but it's likely extremely negligible. So the upside for the rights holders is the content is probably still going to be used elsewhere in places where training is allowed because they have a TDM exception, or because fair use gives companies enough ambiguity to operate. It's already happening. And even in the instance where licensing does become the norm, which I think is highly unlikely because of the geopolitical and economic situation we're in, the upside for the individual creator is likely very, very minimal, the economic upside for an individual creator. So we're trading off countrywide economic effects for a positive that seems not very, very negligible. So I think that's almost the thing that's most interesting to me. There's definitely the point of bias, which is also another con, but I guess I'm less convinced that those negative effects are the most important ones.
Okay, so you're saying that the economic positive impact of AI would outweigh maybe some of the other negative consequences.
And also I think that the point I'm trying to make is that if we're looking at the segment of the population that the licensing regime or an opt-out regime purports to protect, they're actually not winning from this very much.
Great, thank you. Now, moving back to you, Ben, you also have a lot of expertise on a regime that we've already touched on, which is Japan. And we know that they notably have a fairly permissive approach to AI and copyright. So could you tell us a bit more about what regime Japan has in place at the moment and why it felt it was necessary to take that approach?
So in 2000, I suppose I should start off saying the viewers might be a bit surprised, but the language that I speak at home is Japanese and not English. And it's part of the research that I've been doing. So I spent about 5 months in Japan, specifically researching the so-called non-enjoyment AI exception that has been introduced. So it was the first country in 2009 to introduce a TDM exception specific putting aside general open norms like fair use. So in 2009, it introduced a specific exception. And then as a result of the realization that it wasn't flexible enough, it wasn't broad enough, they spent something like 5-6 years investigating how they might improve upon what they had, looking at fair use. So there was a long debate about whether they should introduce fair use or not. And it was decided, for reasons I won't go into, that they wouldn't introduce fair use, but instead what they did was introduce 2, arguably 3 flexible exceptions. And I think the one that we're really talking about here is known as Article 34 for 30-4. And it's aimed, and essentially it's an exception allowing non-enjoyment purposes, as I said at the beginning. So the purpose of copyright is to protect substantial similarity of expression. And therefore, if human beings are not enjoying that work, then that falls outside of the scope of copyright. And so you have this exception endogenous to copyright law, which creates the boundaries. And so basically you can use a work for non-enjoyment purposes as long as it doesn't undermine, unjustifiably prejudice the legitimate interests of the rights holders. So it brings into it the 3-step test, and it has examples of what that might be. So one of the examples is training your technologies on copyright works. So if you're developing, as Nokia is, compression technologies, then you can use copyright works for the development of those compression technologies, something you can't do in the UK. It doesn't have this artificial distinction between commercial and non-commercial research. It also explicitly allows AI training, as long as it doesn't undermine the unjustifiably prejudice the legitimate interests of rights holders. What you won't see in that exception is Japanese law does 2 other things as well. It allows, so they have something called authentic interpretation, which allows prior to a case, government officials to define how the law should be interpreted. So Japanese copyright law itself allows circumvention of technical protection measures for certain purposes, and one of those is research. So you can circumvent the technical protection measures, whereas in this country, when the publishers in universities or research organizations switch the taps off because they sense atypical web traffic, then recent research that we publish, it takes over a month to reinstate that, if at all. Whereas in Japan, they can circumvent the technical protection measures as long as they don't use commercially produced software. What it also does through authentic interpretation, the government has said that they believe, because of the public interest of the economy, society, of having a vibrant machine learning environment, AI, transformative technologies, that private contract cannot override that exception. So it creates a broad basis to certainly allow text and data mining. Obviously, it won't allow substantial similarity where a model trained on Taylor Swift sounds like Taylor Swift. So yeah, a flexible exception. Very much, this came down from the strategy IP headquarters. This is Japan PLC saying, we are backing this transformative technology because it is core to our research-intensive economy.
Great. And we have had an audience question, and I'll direct this to you, Ben, but Julia and Burton, if you also want to jump in as well, please feel free. And it's really to do with the distinction between, I guess, non-enjoyment and enjoyment. So how do you reconcile the exception for non-enjoyment that could be used to justify AI training with the subsequent enjoyment that can be derived from an AI output?
Yeah, so again, there you just, you know, you just go back to the basics of copyright law. What's the training? Nobody sees the training, or very discrete groups see the training data. So it's only really about the output. You know, what is the output? So is the output, as I just said, was it trained on Taylor Swift? Does it look and smell like? Is there substantial similarity in this output with the works of Taylor Swift? You know, so there's been a lot in the Western press, and I actually looked yesterday in the Japanese media about the Ghibli cartoons. You know, Ghibli is not unique. There are lots of studios in Japan. I don't know if there's any anime fans. Stadio Ponoku, they produce stuff that is a similar style to Ghibli. Mamoru Hosoda, Makoto Shinkai, you know, they're all kind of people with big eyes, Western looking. That's a style. That's a style. That's not protected by copyright law. What copyright law protects is substantial similarity. There isn't this furore in the Japanese media. It's quite interesting. You know, people are just like, you know, Ghibli is not unique. This is none of this is unique. It's a style, and that is not what copyright protects. Copyright protects, as I keep saying, substantial similarity of expression.
Great. I'm so happy that you mentioned the Studio Ghibli stuff, actually, because I wanted to ask about that. And for those of you who haven't been following, ChatGPT, a new version was recently released. It allowed people to basically make use of this very distinct Ghibli style and encourage Ghiblification experiments, which I think is a really fun term. So Julia Burton, I'd be curious to hear your views on this. And I suppose the broader question of the evolution of AI as another medium for creativity. So yeah, maybe Julia, you can go ahead first, and then Burton.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear that Studio Ghibli won as a result of the meme that was going around in the internet. So I was looking at the sort of like parent company stock trading, and it like very clearly upticked. People were consuming more Studio Ghibli. I know lots of people who went out and started rewatching the videos, the movies, and you know, I mean, I think if anything, the meme shows how AI can actually be a positive force for content creation, and not just something that replaces content. And yeah, I mean, I like it, from my perspective. I feel like the arguments that this like AI slop is not going to actually take over content were kind of reaffirmed by the instance.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Burton, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I also see this, and as Ben just explained, it's not the style that is protected by copyright, it's a particular expression of that style that is protected. And so if there are many Ghibli lookalikes that are being produced, that increases competition around the popular product, and that's something that we should welcome, I think. And if AI facilitates that, that's a good thing to do. That's not something that we should try to stop. So yeah, I don't see this particularly as a problem. Of course, it's up to courts to finally decide how close you can come to a particular expression or how far you have to stay away from it. I don't think it's possible to set general standards or general norms for that. That's a case-by-case issue. Aisha, I also see there's another audience question that came up in the chat on. Can I answer that question?
Of course, yeah, sure. I'll just read it out. So we've got what role does access to training data play in achieving the UK's ambitions around AI in critical sectors like healthcare, finance, or logistics?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And for me, the question boils down to to what extent are data in those sectors covered by copyright or maybe by other rights? I can imagine in healthcare, copyright is not so much a big issue, but data privacy, data protection is an important issue. And so you run into other constraints for access to training data. In finance, again, I don't think copyright is so much of an issue, but maybe trade secrets for banks and financial institutions can become an issue. Similarly in logistics. And so the question is how many of these legal constraints on access to data are we going to allow to feed into AI and slow down AI development, or do we find solutions for that? I see that in AI modeling technology and data technology, there are increasingly technical solutions for all these problems. We have things like federated learning, for example, that keep the data in the places where they are. They don't move them to a central place for the AI developers. So it is quite possible to, and at the same time, keep some degree of protection for those data, and at the same time, allow them to be used for model training without affecting the interests of the users. And I think in the longer run, for copyright, that may also be a solution, because rights holders say, I'm worried that my product is going to get reflected in the model outputs. But if your product from which data are taken for model training stays in one place, is not reproduced in a database for the AI model trainer, then I think this could offer some sense of security for media rights holders and still enable model training to go ahead. This will also become very important in the near future when these models are going to be used as personal assistants. When I, as a user, and I instruct my AI personal assistant to read, for instance, the newspaper to which I have a subscription, but to read the entire newspaper and give me a summary of that, would that be allowed? Under current conditions of copyright, this is not entirely clear. Although I've paid for the subscription, I'm not meant to machine learn on that subscription. And the EU Code of Practice for the implementation of AI makes it very clear. It makes a distinction between collecting data for model training and collecting data for search and crawlers. And so an AI assistant who goes searching around in my newspaper subscription would be subject to different constraints. So I think this is a new problem that we still have to deal with in the future.
Can I sort of?
Yes, yeah, of course.
So yes, a very good question. Of course, healthcare, finance, logistics are like any other part of our research-intensive economy. You know, they're very, very much based in the need to do research. You know, healthcare and being very obvious, finance, I think, being very obvious. So there's a vast body of literature which shows that the legal rules that we create around accessing information, research information, scientific information is crucially important for the economy. So 57% of research intensive industries say that access to research, publicly funded research, is the most important thing for their business. And even the least research intensive industry, food, it's around 24% that say the same thing. There's a very interesting, another study that I like in Denmark showed that 27% of products and 19% of processes developed over the last 3 years would have been postponed or entirely abandoned without access to research and being able to use the research that they have accessed. And I think, you know, that's why the opt-out is so problematic for research intensive industries, because they have legal access already. You know, it sits on the web, or in terms of scientific literature, it's been paid for once by the taxpayer, and then it's been paid for again in terms of subscriptions. So it is not going to support data-driven innovation if you then have to relicense information that you've already paid for sort of 2 or 3 times. So yeah, very, very important question.
Great. And I think that, yeah, go ahead, Burton.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer this question in the chat on the thoughts on how to incentivize creatives to create art if they receive so little licensing revenue and they have to accept that their works will be used in training. My answer to that question would be to say, when their art is used for model training, it does not affect their business model and their outlets. They can still sell their creative art through the same channels as they used to do. Because as long as their art is not reproduced in the output of the generative AI model, there is no direct competition with that. Also, the solution that has been proposed, for example, in Brazil, and that's another question in the chat, where they grant extensive licensing revenue rights to creatives. I wonder how they're going to implement that system, because there will be millions of rights holders on all the web pages and pictures on the internet, most of which are unidentifiable and unknown. How are you going to remunerate these people, and how much remuneration will you give them? 1/100 of a cent or a pence? It's not worth the transaction cost. So although it looks very nice on paper, I don't see how it would work in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are starting to approach time, and I had another question I wanted to ask each of you, given your respective research areas and also your regional expertise. What is a lesson that the UK can learn from these different regions to avoid some of the traditional pitfalls that come from AI and copyright? Maybe Julia, you'd like to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I think my view is pretty clear and pretty simple, which is copyright should be focusing on output that is similar to rights holders' output, and it makes a lot of sense to have a system that goes pretty hard on instances of infringement when outputs are copyright rights holders' content, but having flexibility on how on the systems that are built and how technology learns from content out that's publicly available is most likely the best way forward. And one thing I'll just say really quickly that hasn't been mentioned yet is sort of the implementation effects are pretty having a system that's more simplified, like a TDM exception, makes the burden for courts, the burden for businesses that then want to deploy this technology far smaller. And I think it's very underrated, the negative effects that uncertainty can have from a public sector perspective, because your courts, and in the UK we already have courts that are overburdened. Can get even more overburdened, and there's a lot of legal uncertainty that can come out of that system. And then also when it comes to businesses being reticent to deploy AI because of the legal uncertainty, that's another sort of second order effect that would come from a more convoluted system, like one that's actually being one that has a separate regime for scientific materials, or one that has an opt-out scheme.
Great, thank you. Ben, Burton, we've got 2 minutes left. So yeah, what is a lesson we can learn from for the UK?
So I think the lesson we can learn from these regimes like Japan, South Korea, and America, all who have very large cultural exports, is it's not a zero-sum game. The Japanese creative industries actively supported the introduction of Article 34 because they understood that. We're a medium-sized economy. The large language models have been built. We don't have first mover advantage in many areas of AI. We do have strength in finance, in the sciences and the research intensive industries. DeepSeek ChatGPT hopefully will issue open models. So through open technological structures with more flexible copyright regimes, this is an area that the UK economy can really capitalize on and ensure that its sort of analog strength in STEM industries is replicated in the AI economy.
Great, thanks. And finally, Bertin.
Yeah, just very quickly, lesson learned from me is unleash the AI spirits. Let them go. Let them grow. Let them grow. Don't put any obstacles in their way, copyright-related or other regulatory obstacles. The only obstacle that you would have to put in terms of copyright is to avoid that AI models exactly reproduce their copyright-protected training inputs. All the rest is superficial. Superfluous.
Which we don't have to do because copyright has done that for 300 years.
Yeah.
Great. So if I can summarize, so we've got focus on the outputs. Simpler implementation means greater certainty, not a zero-sum game. Open technological structures is an area that the UK can capitalize on, and unleash the AI spirits, which I think is a great way to end the discussion. So yeah, thank you all so much for both attending, and also thank you to my wonderful panelists for their time this afternoon. I think we all eagerly await the government's response to its recent consultation, and I hope that hearing from our experts today has shed some light on the significance of the government's proposed changes, but also what an opportunity it has to cultivate a strong AI and creator economy. Above all else, I hope that the main thing you take away today is that for the UK, a permissive regime really is the way forward. Thank you again. I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and take care.